But we're going to shift over to some good news. And so I already mentioned before you were here, Eli, I already gave you a bit of an introduction,
Cool.
and people know that last night was the 35th anniversary of the Meares Island Tribal Park. We talked a little bit about that last week. I think probably a few people on the webinar. There's about 54 people on here right now, of mostly Sierra Club BC supporters or new supporters. So a few of you may have actually been able to go to that event last night, but most of you probably not. We're all around the province, and some even, I know there's somebody from New York here on the call. So I'll turn it over to Eli, who's been very, very busy this week, and would love you just to introduce yourself and maybe talk a bit about last night.
Excellent. Hello. Hi there, folks. Yeah, so just a little addition to what has been said here is that last night was the first of several celebrations of the 35th year anniversary of the Meares Island Tribal Park. And we're traveling tomorrow, a group of us, including some students from Quest and some Engo partners, to Tofino, and we're going to be having more of a ceremonial and community potluck type celebration at the Tinwis Resort. And then on the 21st of April, we're heading over a much smaller group to Tsisakis, or Heelboom Bay, where the blockades happened in 1984. But there's going to be stuff happening right up to December 15th before we prepare for the winter solstice and the Clayoquot. And yeah, I mean, the big thing that I want to, part of the reason why I'm making such a big deal out of this Meares Island Tribal Park celebration is exactly the kind of bad news that we're getting from people like Jens and the province. And the old Malcolm X quote pops into my head: I have more respect for a man who lets me know where he stands than one that comes up like an angel but is nothing but a devil. It's pretty harsh, but it feels like that sometimes. It feels like people come out and they say they're going to respect UNDRIP, TRC, they're going to work with Indigenous peoples, and then it kind of disarms us a little bit, right? It placates us. It makes us less aware. And then next thing you know, you've got a bunch of bikers logging the hell out of your territory. Excuse my language. And so it is challenging. And the reason why the Meares Island Tribal Park celebration was so key is that we want to embolden people. We want to encourage them that it can be done. It feels sometimes hopeless. But it was proven 35 years ago that if you believe in yourself and you know who you are and you follow the teachings of your ancestors, then it is possible. Sorry, I just saw the group chat thing bopping away there. Easily distracted. No. So yes, those trees are still standing. And, you know, the province and the feds have never recognized the Meares Island Tribal Park formally, and I'm glad they haven't. I don't want their paper, I don't want their paper, recognition. We want appropriate recognition. And for us, it's more important that we work with civil society organizations, people, and I just finished saying this to a group of students and Engos who are meeting in the next room next door here, that sovereign authority doesn't originate in the halls of power in Ottawa. Sovereign authority originates in each and every citizen of this country. And so we entrust our sovereign authority with the governments to govern on our behalf. And that's where we've kind of been running into some problems. And so citizens of this country can work together, Indigenous peoples and civil society organizations, to not just hold government accountable, because when we do that, we give our power away. But what we can do is we can come together and create innovative, compelling partnerships and visions, and we can invest in it, not just financially, but with our energy and with our Zagin Dawin, the abundance of love and relationship. And we can create that new future. When we wait for government to do it, unfortunately, my friends, this 4-year election cycle and so-called democracy, it's a distraction from what's really going on. I'll have to say it. It doesn't really work. It's kind of silly, to be frank. If we were in Clayoquot and Nuu-chah-nulth, where I'm from, on my father's side of my family, we wouldn't change up our leaders every 2 to 4 years. That's silly. And it's just like going on a canoe journey or a pack trip, and you change up your steersman every 2 hours, and everyone has a different idea on where to go. We end up making no progress. And when people paddle when you paddle, if you're not paddling together, it's choppy progress, and it's hard to move forward. But if everyone's paddling together, you're all moving in one clean movement, and that canoe moves forward. And you get to where you're going a lot faster. But first, you have to understand the moon cycles. You have to understand the patterns of the moon cycles. I said audio's lost.
Uh-oh. I'm going to just check in with Henry. Henry here is our volunteer who's monitoring the chat.
Yeah, I think I can still hear you. It
Okay.
might just be for that one participant. So I think
great. Thanks a lot. And so since I interrupted anyway, Eli, I'll just tell you that he's monitoring the chat. And so he'll be, as people ask questions, he can pick out a few and ask you. So if you ever want to go to questions, it's up to you.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah. So, the Wickaninnish Tribal Park was created with a 500-year vision. And the reason why we chose that time frame is because it's sort of like the minimum time frame for canoe log. And the elders gave us direction to ensure that there's canoe logs for the unborn future generations to come. So we have to plan based on our cultural keystone species. And so we're not talking about 4 years or the next quarter return on investment. We're talking deep into the future. And recently, we've been involved in conversations at home about a 1,000-year vision. And so these things are important to think about when you think about your democracy, because the reality of the situation is that the elder societies of this country that's called Canada, the elder societies have a proven track record of resiliency. They have a proven track record of abundability or sustainability. We don't like to use this term sustainable because it doesn't go far enough in our view. Just to sustain the status quo consumption is not, in our view, the broadly accepted definition of sustainability is to meet the needs of today's generation without compromising future generations' ability to meet their needs. In Nuu-chah-nulth, we talk about abundability, but through observing natural law and having an undistorted perception of what's happening around you, you can learn little hacks, little elegant solutions on how to have a more abundant relationship with your ecosystem, so that your active economy, your relationship between society and environment, that's economy, that it can be in line with natural law, and you can actually cultivate more abundance in the ecosystem. And so that's the kind of thinking, and those are the kinds of innovations that we want to bring back to bear in this country called Canada. And while I say that word, I want to ask a question. Does anyone on this webinar, and you don't have to actually answer it, but you can answer it in your own minds, who knows what the word Canada means? What does the word Canada mean? If you're a Canadian, you should know what you're calling yourself. What does the word Canada mean? And in whose language is the word Canada? Whose language is that? It's a word in a language. What is that language? And then why? Why is this country adorned with a Haudenosaunee word that means village? And look back at the geopolitical history. So when we talk about understanding your citizenship and understand what it means to be a Canadian, we really need to understand the founding multilateral environmental agreements of this country. The peace and friendship treaties were not just trickery. They weren't just cultural niceties. They were nation-to-nation multilateral environmental agreements. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy was concerned about the insatiable consumption of the newcomers and how quickly they consumed resources and how destructive their practices were in 1764. And so the Treaty of Fort Niagara in 1764 was a multilateral environmental agreement. And so this process of reconciliation is not a linear trajectory into the future. Reconciliation is an off-ramp that allows us to rediscover our origin story as a nation state. And so the other thing I want to say, just circling back on this idea of economy, because it's become a dirty word for some people and it's become a narcissistic obsession for others. Economy is related to the word ecology and ecosystem. They share a common root heritage. They share a common root heritage in an older language, an older society. And that root word is eco, which comes from oikos. Ology is the study of, ecology is the study of eco, or oikos. Ecosystem are the different kinds of eco or oikos systems, rainforest ecosystems, desert oikos systems, and then economy. What does then economy mean? People refer to the economy, the strength of the economy, the health of the economy. It's an emerging economy, as though it's a thing. It's been phenomenologicalized. But in reality, economy is the wise and prudent management of oikos. Economy is the wise and prudent management of the house, the biosphere, the metaphorical house that we all live in. And so does the rest of creation. And so we need to repatriate the term economy and understand how we got so far away in our thinking to think that gross domestic product and what you call currency fluctuations, inflation, supply and demand, how all of these things became how we think of economy. That's not economy at all. Those are political arrangements, to be frank. The global economic system is a power dynamic that was the result of the two big wars and the Cold War. And he who has the most nuclear bombs gets to be the big dominator in the global economy. I studied political science and international politics, and I learned early on that the so-called global economy is a political arrangement, and I consider it to be a violent political arrangement because it takes advantage of so-called undeveloped countries and uses them for primary extraction, and we create puppet governments that, such as our own 2 to 4 year election cycles. Anyways, to understand what how we made that shift from having a dialogue about how can we create a more fair and just society. We used to ask, I think we used to ask those questions. How can we make this country more fair and just? And now the leadership is, the questions asked by the late finance minister, John Flaherty, I think, is how the primary question government should be concerning itself with is how do we create more jobs? What an uninspiring idea of a nation state. Let's go back to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. We're on a webinar. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 is the origin of what's called the Westphalian state system, the idea of sovereignty and non-interference among political global, what you call nation states. And the Leviathan, 1653, Thomas Hobbes' book, The Leviathan, was published about the nature of sovereign power, and the Leviathan being the metaphorical sovereign power that that creates collective security. But the peace and friendship treaties go beyond that. It's not just about collective security. Although the United States used the Great Law of Peace and the Peace and Friendship Treaties and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy model as inspiration for their own United States Confederacy, as did the League of Nations and ultimately the United Nations. But what was not transferred well through those aspirations was the other compendiums to collective security that the peace and friendship treaties bring to us, which are 1, bioregional economics, and 2, peaceful commerce. And so through IPCAs and tribal parks, what we're really doing is we're reapplying very old systems of economy, very old systems of governance, peaceful commerce and bioregional economics with collective security, for sure, into a modern day context and trying to reestablish cross-cultural literacy so that the two cultures can not integrate or a melting pot, but truly be a mosaic and complement one another. So maybe on that note, I'll just rest my tongue and maybe see if there's any questions that have been generated so far.
Thanks, Eli. So I'll turn it over to you, Henry. Are there any questions?
Actually, there haven't been any questions other than sort of technical ones in the text feed from users yet. So I'd like to encourage people to post any. Oh, we've just had one pop up here. Here we go. Jennifer, thank you.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. Did you see that one, Eli?
Commerce. Yeah, sure.
Yes. Okay, great.
There was a book published in 2009 that I highly recommend. It's called Resilience, Reciprocity, and Ecological Economics. The subtitle is Northwest Coast Sustainability, although I don't agree with the term sustainability. It was published in 2009 by Routledge. The author is Dr. Ronald Trosper. Ron Trosper is a recovering, what's that big fancy university in the States?
Harvard, yeah.
Harvard, yes, Harvard economics guy. And he wanted to add something meaningful to the global dialogue, which is being proliferated by the Resilience Alliance. Check out the Resilience Alliance. A bunch of really good meaning and intelligent and active silver-haired people, retired academics and government bureaucrats who have been creating a body of work called social ecological resilience theory. And this talks about threshold transformations and such. But what Trosper recognized was that there was a gap in this body of emerging social ecological resilience theory, and he wanted to add something to that, which is this resilience, reciprocity, and ecological economics. This looks back at the great elder societies of the Pacific Northwest who have a proven track record of resiliency for 10,000 plus years, 12,000, 13,000. The number keeps going up. The mark of a great civilization is existence for 2,000 years without destroying yourself. And so resilience, reciprocity, and ecological economics was an inverse of the series called Collapse, which looked at ancient civilizations that failed and what were the common denominators of the failure of those civilizations. Trosper looked at these elder societies that not only had been resilient and abundant for thousands and thousands of years longer than the great civilizations that we emulate, that we hold up as the classical great civilizations, but also continue to survive in light of, in the fact of these culturally genocidal practices and the systematic and really robust efforts to destroy our cultures here in the North Pacific. And one of the things that he identified was the practice of what you could call institutionalized generosity, or the practice of ceremoniously giving away surplus goods. So as we know, the war is a very costly endeavor to societies. The society bears the cost of that war. Individuals may profit from war making, but the society itself bears the cost of that. And what did Leo Tolstoy say? As long as there are slaughterhouses, there will be war fields. The connection between how we treat domesticated animals and how that reflects in our interhuman relations. Point being there that institutionalized generosity creates an opportunity for us to allow for surplus goods to go to neighbors so that those neighbors don't have to come and take our surplus goods. If I build up castle walls around my goods, I create an adversarialness. I have goods, you don't. I come and I take your extras, but I just store it all behind these walls. That's a very expensive way. But Trosper hypothesized that the practice of indigenous peoples, the practice of our indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, of ceremoniously through potlatches, ceremoniously giving away surplus goods to neighboring tribes, is less expensive, and is sort of like, there was a great peace scholar in recent years who said that peace is not just the absence of war, it's the presence of justice and good relations. And so these peace and friendship treaties are true to that. Let us not just have peace or the absence of war, let us have friendship and zagindawin, abundant relationships of love, like where a river goes into a lake and you've got that delta with all that abundability. And so that's an example. I would highly recommend that. I've taught courses on that book. I've used it as a textbook for courses, and I'm going to continue to tell everyone about it. So that's an example of what I'm talking about. But the pre-Confederacy, the pre-contact peace and friendship treaties amongst the Haudenosaunee is another example of what you call peaceful commerce.
Thanks very much, Eli. I have another question here from Terry, and Terry was wondering if you could speak to the history of the Meares Island Tribal Council, its mandate, how it came to be, and its current challenges.
So the Meares Island, it's Meares Island Tribal Parks. There's the Clayoquot. Clayoquot are the confederacy of tribes of Nuu-chah-nulth peoples from a place called Clayoquot. English people call it Clayoquot. Clayoquot is just another way of saying Clayoquot. And anyways, that has, like I said, 10,000 plus years of history, and continued to persist in the aftermath of residential schools and Indian Act and blah, blah, blah. The Meares Island Tribal Park, however, was declared in 1984, 35 years ago. And it came about because Macmillan Bloedel had been given essentially unbridled permits to clear-cut log the hell out of the province of British Columbia. And of course, they had some family and friendship connections with government. This is the silly thing about Canadian governments and provincial governments, is how the permitting, those are theoretically common resources, but only a few people benefit tremendously from them. It's quite criminal, in fact, and it's unethical. So Macmillan Bloedel had these permits to log 90% of Meares Island. And my uncle Moses Martin was the elected chief at that time, and he stepped in with a firm but loving hand in an exercise of ESOC to stop the logging from happening. And he knew that the employees, the human beings that were employed by Macmillan Bloedel, they themselves were not evil. They themselves were not really the ones truly prospering and benefiting from those permit uses, that there was a few people in the Macmillan Bloedel family that were profiting intensely. So he wanted to go and welcome and educate the people that this is not a tree farm license, this is Wickaninnish. And so the tribal park was an innovation to create cross-cultural literacy between Nuu-chah-nulth thinking peoples and the newcomers. And the idea is once you medicine someone, you change the way they think, and then then their words come out differently and their actions are different after that too. So that's why paradigm shift is so important. And you know, it's taken 35 years, but we're still making steady progress on that.
Great, thanks, Eli. The next question I have here is regarding federal government funding for Indigenous protected conservation areas. Are the federal government grasping UNDRIP in this context, and does the BC government support nations interested in this opportunity?
Yes, we were invited into the teepee, so to speak, in 2016 in supporting / co-leading the Pathway to Canada Target 1, which was a federal initiative that's aimed at increasing parks and protected areas to 17% of the terrestrial land of Canada, including inland waterways, and 10% of marine and coastal environments. And although we as Nuu-chah-nulth peoples and Indigenous peoples generally think that it's sort of a kindergartner kind of idea to think you can protect 17% and everything's going to be okay, it's really naive to think in percentages and pieces. But we support the initiative as an exercise in reconciliation. You're not leaving, are you? Oh. Okay.
We're on our way out the door.
Okay. Yeah. So what was I saying? Okay. Next question.
Yeah, so I'd like to encourage all of the people listening to keep the questions coming.
What was the last question that I didn't fully answer?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, it was a question from Enns, and he was asking about the.
Do they respect it?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, see, there's the idea, though, is that we've been invited into the teepee, but we want to make sure that these, because essentially, I mean, there's a skeptical view, which is that The feds invited us in because they knew that they would never be able to achieve their goal without our participation, because we would just that we would just sue them and blockade them, because parks and protected areas, as you could imagine, have not always been a good experience for Indigenous peoples. In fact, they've been some of the worst experiences. Riding Mountain National Park was created. Anishinaabe people were kicked out of their villages and their houses were literally burned down so that newcomers or white people could have cabins around the lake so they could go somewhere nice for the summer. It makes me feel physically ill when I think about how parks and protected areas have behaved. And so they realized that they needed to have us involved, otherwise we'd stall them all along. The optimistic view of that is that they genuinely wanted to have Indigenous perspectives, and they genuinely believe that Indigenous peoples have something to offer in terms of biodiversity conservation. And I oscillate between the two often, but I'm predominantly an optimistic person. And based on the people that I've met who are employed with the federal government, I think that there's great promise there with the people that I work with at the employee level. And the way we think about those things, Jen and others, is that we can create places where we get the relationship right. Indigenous protected and conserved areas can be thought about as places where we, as best possible, role model and emulate what good, respectful relationships look like. Not just between human beings with each other, but between humanity and the rest of creation, or the other creatures that we share the environment with and with whom we've co-evolved over thousands of years in sacred relationship.
Okay, great.
Maybe one more question?
Yeah, one more question.
One more question. Eli's got to say some goodbyes to some of the people leaving the workshop that just happened earlier.
Yeah, I think Jens had a follow-up question. Hold on, let me just try and...
It doesn't surprise me.
He was wondering whether... Sorry, he said, what about BC government support for IPCAs and nations that seek federal support?
Well, what I've heard from the province is that one of the things I've heard lots of different things. One of the things I've heard is that they're apprehensive about creating new parks and protected areas because they can't even really manage the ones well that they have already. And this is part of the problem of conventional parks and protected areas, is their high operational cost. The operations and maintenance of parks, the way they've been done in Canada, is costly. For a lot of reasons, it's costly. In many ways, it's costly. And so they're apprehensive to create new parks and protected areas. Sure, you might have this sexy $1.3 billion carrot, but what about when that money's gone? Who's going to be left holding the bag for the operations and maintenance of these new parks and protected areas? So I understand that, and that's why I think by working together, we can create a more viable model of parks and protected areas. So yeah, it's a bit of a mixed bag. Okay, thank you very much for your, and please feel free to keep record of any other questions.
Yeah, I'll keep
I'm just going over there,
yeah.
and then even if I later on come back.
Okay.
But Clayoquot, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much, Eli. So that was Eli Enns, and we're really lucky to be able to come into his home today, and in the midst of all this activity and action that's going on around the 35th anniversary of the tribal park on Meares Island. They're all headed up to Clayoquot Sound tomorrow, I believe. So I think we're going to leave it at that. And what I'm going to do is a couple housekeeping things for next week, but I will save the chat questions. And if there's anything hanging there that would be good for Eli to answer, then I can follow up with him. Now, it looks like, Jens, you want to offer just a bit more on the feds. So Henry, do we have Jens unmuted?
I think so. Jens,
Okay,
can you
go
hear
ahead,
us?
Jens.
Yes, and thanks for that. Unfortunately, Eli had to go, but I only wanted to share the additional context that the 17% target that is an internationally agreed to goal that nations are supporting in the context of the United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity is obviously a very important international goal in light of the unraveling of ecosystem and habitat for species and so on. And it's something that I want to encourage you all to share. For example, if you have opportunities to talk with MLAs or other levels of government that people in British Columbia want the BC government to support the goal of the federal government to protect 17%, and British Columbia has to play a key role because arguably the most diverse ecosystems and some of the most endangered species can be found in British Columbia. So it's very important for BC to contribute its part to increase protection in the short term from about 15 to 17%, and support nations like Eli's as much as possible in this context. Those nations that want to protect more land as indigenous protected areas. And it's really quite stunning that we have not heard, I've never heard the BC government saying anything about this 17% target. So it's something that we as concerned citizens have to remind the BC government about. So just want to add this for context.
Great. Thank you, Jens. We've got, okay, looks like one quick question for you, Jens, while you're on here. How do we start not only preaching to the converted and start getting folks who don't normally think about these things excited and interested in taking action?
It's not easy. One of the things that some of the campaigners in the last few years is traveling all parts of Vancouver Island, not only sharing information about the state of the forest in Victoria or Vancouver, but in places like Campbell River, Port Alberni, Port McNeill, and those discussions are much more challenging because there are more participants that are working in the woods, that have jobs in forestry, and it's difficult, but it is absolutely possible to look at some of the concerning trends and have a discussion and come to some acknowledgement that, wow, in fact, old growth forests are a non-renewable resource, and there's some acknowledgement even among loggers that we will eventually run out of old growth trees, and it's necessary to have a transition plan. But other than that, some of the things that you all heard about before, like getting media coverage to make sure that British Columbians have the information about how little is left, how little is protected, and how much we are still logging is very important. And I think it's difficult to change people's perspectives, but it does happen over time. So it is very important to get the information out there as much as possible through media, through letters, talking about this with your neighbors and with people that maybe have a different view, so that we move a little bit from denial to acceptance as a society that things have to change when we cross red lines for climate change, red lines for old growth, and so on.
Thank you, Jens. Yeah, and we're going to talk more as the series goes on. This is week 2 of an 8-part series. We're going to get into more about what we can do to take action. Last week, we offered the action of a very simple one, to simply post a photo of yourself in a forest that you love. And to your question, Monica, about how do we start getting folks who don't think about these things or care about these things interested in taking action, before they're going to be interested in taking action, they have to have a connection. And so we're talking about forests, old growth forests or second growth forests, really any forest. It starts with people being out in the forest and having a connection to the place. And so, one thing we can always do is take our friends and family and neighbors, invite them on a walk, take them to a place that's accessible to them, and have that, give them the chance to connect. So thanks to everybody who posted those amazing, beautiful photos of the forest last week, and you can still do that on our Facebook group. The action, and I put this in the email I sent about an hour ago, but the action for this week is another simple one. It's some of you may have done it, but it's sending a letter through our website to Minister Doug Donaldson, the BC Forest Minister. So it's rainforestisland.ca. .ca. And if you go there, you can also just go to sierraclub.bc.ca and find it. And there's a form letter there. You can change it, you can update it, you can make it your own. And we've already sent, along with help from Lead Now, we've sent about around 20,000 of these letters, and it really does make an impact. We've been meeting regularly with Doug Donaldson's office and hearing that he knows that he's getting all these letters. He knows that people care, and so we really need to increase the amount of contact that he's getting on this issue. So that's a simple action for this week. If you haven't already done it, send that letter. If you have done it, then tell a friend about rainforestisland.ca, send them the link, or sit them down in front of it, talk to them about why it matters, and ask them to send the letter. So again, we've got 6 more weeks, and we'll get more and more into actions. But I'm really excited about next week. Next week we have 2 guests. We have Sierra Club BC's Executive Director, Hannah Askew, and she's going to be joined by a woman named Sharon McKenzie from up in the Chilcotin, from Silcotin First Nation. So we're gonna hear about that part of the province. And Sharon is an educator. She's someone who makes medicines and really lives on the land and has an experience of the land that that most people don't have. Hannah Askew will be able to give some of the context of the Chilcotin case, really important title case, and set that up. And then we'll be hearing from Sharon and her experience there. So really encourage you to check that out. That's next week, same time, same place, here on Zoom at 12 o'clock Pacific time. Thanks everybody so much for joining the webinar today, and see you either on the Facebook group, or you can send me an email if you're not on Facebook. Henry, do you have any other final words before we go off?
No, just thanks so much to everyone for taking part today. It was a fascinating talk, and really nice to have a bit of a different subject to explore from last week, and we've got more of that coming in the next few weeks. So I hope to see you all there.
Awesome. Thanks for your help, Henry, on this webinar and all the webinars. And thanks again, Jens, for jumping in with the update. And see you all next week.